Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we talk about the Santa Fe Southern Pacific merger and why you shouldn't paint so fast. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may, hopefully, quite possibly could maybe one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I want to talk with you about the Southern Pacific Santa Fe, or Santa Fe Southern Pacific. You'll see why we describe it that way in a moment. And I just want to take a quick second to give a little apology out to those of you who have ordered some things on Etsy or a couple of our other outlets. I have to apologize. I have been very swamped lately, so I haven't had a chance to get the items out to you, James E. and a few others. So thank you for being patient. We will get back on track, no pun intended. But we've got some exciting new items to put out there for you, and also speeding up our shipping so that we will be moving much faster than a Penn Central train in winter. So let's get to Santa Fe Southern Pacific, or Southern Pacific Santa Fe. Now, what am I talking about? Well, this is an ill-fated merger that was to have happened in the 1980s, and it would have been the combination of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway and the Southern Pacific Railroad. Now, these are two of railroading's most venerable names, and quite frankly, this is something that by all calculations, very well should have happened, especially at a time when the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was the railroad's economic regulator, was approving mergers left and right. And not just mergers, but also rail line spinoffs and so on. After all, this is the early 1980s. It is after the passage of the Staggers Rail Act for deregulation. The stain of the Penn Central is still upon the industry, and there is a broad understanding that if railroading is going to survive, there will have to be some combinations, and these combinations are in fact going to make railroads stronger, as opposed to just making the case that combinations are necessary in order to help out a weak railroad here or otherwise. Now, where does the term Kodachrome and shouldn't paint so fast and all of that come from? Well, if you're looking behind me, if you're on CP5 cam, you see the thumbnail, which shows a locomotive, or a couple locomotives actually, painted in an odd scheme. It is red, black, and yellow, and this is what was called the Kodachrome paint scheme, and I'll show you why. This was, of course, intended to be the scheme that the Southern Pacific Santa Fe, which would have been the name of the railroad, would have worn had the merger actually taken place. And so we will get you over to CP5 cam here in a moment and get this for you. There you go. That is a box of Kodachrome film, Kodachrome 64. This was actually the most popular film for rail photographers to use, but you can tell the box is the same color as the locomotives. You have red and yellow with black lettering, somewhat close to what Southern Pacific Santa Fe would have been. Now, the nickname, of course, shouldn't paint so fast, or the epithet shouldn't paint so fast. That was created by the meme makers of the 1980s, had there been memes, and it was using the initials of the railroad, Southern Pacific Santa Fe, SPSF, and shouldn't paint so fast came about because a variety of locomotives were painted by both railroads in the merger scheme, with the lettering set up so that all it would take is adding the letters of the other railroad. So the Southern Pacific units had an SP on them, the Santa Fe units had an SF on them, and after the merger was approved, all you do is put in the SP or the SF, depending on the locomotive, and voila, you would have a fully painted locomotive. Now, let's go back in the history so we can understand a little bit more about what happened. Now, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific were both incredibly strong railroads. Now, the Santa Fe in 1995, just before it ended its operation as an independent carrier, was 9,126 miles. At its height, it was a little over 13,000 route miles, and its principal route stretched from Chicago, Illinois to Los Angeles, California, via Kansas City, La Junta, Colorado, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, it also reached Denver, Houston, and the Gulf Coast chemical regions on the Gulf Coast, of course, and that includes Galveston, Texas, where its successor, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF, continues to maintain a very strong presence. Now, it had an extensive Granger network in Kansas and Oklahoma, and that means that it served a lot of agricultural shippers there, and it had a lot of branch lines in addition to its main line, which we call now in BNSF days the Transcon. It also had a very large presence in California. Now, by contrast, the Southern Pacific, which also had a big presence in California, extended from Portland, Oregon to New Orleans, Louisiana. It was headquartered in San Francisco, and for many years, it was the dominant force in California, and that means economically, politically, you name it, the Southern Pacific ran the show. And it had a storied past because it was the heir to the Central Pacific, which many of you know as being the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, the Central Pacific was formed first, then came the Southern Pacific. Eventually, the Southern Pacific took over the Central Pacific, and legally, from what I understand, and I gotta verify this, but I do understand that they actually merged the Southern Pacific into the Central Pacific and changed the name to Southern Pacific. And that's something we'll discuss in an upcoming episode where we talk about mergers, because it's interesting to understand the reasons why the attorneys will often structure transactions the way they do. But we'll have a little bit of that coming into this discussion as well. The Southern Pacific at its height was also greater than 13,000 route miles, and it was part of E.H. Harriman's empire at one point, together with the Union Pacific. So at one point, he controlled both of those carriers, and as we know today, in 2024, they would eventually be merged together. Now, in the 1960s, the Missouri Pacific made a run at the Santa Fe. It had actually enlisted the help of a brokerage house, which I believe was Goldman Sachs, although it could be escaping me for the moment, in order to acquire its stock and try to pressure the carrier into a merger. And this was part of a dual-pronged effort on the MOP's part because, number one, remember, the Missouri Pacific had a very interesting corporate structure that was left over from its days as being part of the Allegheny Corporation empire, and it spent years looking for ways that it could merge with some other company or convince Allegheny to let go of the preferred stock, which totally distorted the capital structure and gave this company that had very little investment comparatively the ability to dictate how it operated. So one of the schemes that the Missouri Pacific management, then under the Mississippi River Fuel Corporation, which would later change its name to Missouri Pacific Corporation, came up with was maybe they would merge with the Santa Fe. And actually, a Missouri Pacific Santa Fe merger would not have been a bad idea, in large part because the Missouri Pacific, which stretched from its namesake area, St. Louis, Kansas City, and so on, down into Texas to the Gulf, had a very extensive network that filled in a lot of the holes where Santa Fe didn't. And if you combine their Granger networks in Missouri, in Colorado, as well as Oklahoma, and so on, you would have had a very strong agricultural powerhouse that would have been formidable had it happened. However, this just didn't go anywhere. The Santa Fe really wasn't interested. And while the Missouri Pacific did have a very entrepreneurial management team, with William Marbury at the helm of the company and Downing Jinks leading the railroad operation, they were not able to overcome the Santa Fe's opposition. And at the time, the Santa Fe was, of course, a very large and strong railroad that was certainly the equal to the Missouri Pacific. Now, a little while later, the Southern Pacific pursued the seaboard coastline, and that also could have been a transformational merger for the rail industry because the Southern Pacific, as we mentioned, it stretched from as far west as Portland, Oregon, and coming on to New Orleans. It also had a subsidiary called the Cotton Belt, the St. Louis Southwestern, which got it into St. Louis, Missouri, going through St. Louis, Missouri. And I do believe they also made it into East St. Louis, Illinois, if anything, making interchanges with Eastern rail carriers. Going through Arkansas and then up into Missouri. This was a strong system. And then adding that to the Seaboard Coastline, which, remember, controlled the Louisville and Nashville, the Georgia Railroad, the Clinchfield, the Atlanta and West Point, the Western Railway of Alabama, and had significant shareholdings in the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. That would have been a system that stretched from coast to coast as far east as Richmond, Virginia, and effectively Washington, D.C., not to mention the Seaboard Coastline's strong network in Florida. Connections would have been made indirectly through the L&N in New Orleans, but that certainly would have been a merger that the Interstate Commerce Commission would have had, while a tough time approving, it certainly would have been in the best interest of both shippers and also shareholders of both carriers. However, Ben Biagini, who was then leading the Southern Pacific and was one of two people who can very much be considered iconic leaders of that company after DJ Russell, was certainly someone that was a big personality. And as we've seen with a lot of railroad mergers and in the business community in general, one of the things that typically derails a lot of these potential combinations is the personalities of the people in charge. And if you're someone like a Tom Rice or Prime Osborne, who were the big leaders in the Seaboard Coastline at the time, they would simply be run over or expected to be run over by Ben Biagini, who most certainly did not expect to be second fiddle to these guys. And therefore, despite purchasing something around 8% of the stock and doing everything they could to push the Seaboard Coastline to merge with them, the SCL said no, and this pretty much cast off Biagini and the Southern Pacific into the veritable merger abyss. Now, as we all know, the Seaboard Coastline would end up going to the wedding chapel with the Chessie system, and that's what created CSX. But in the case of the Southern Pacific, it went out and started working with the Santa Fe in the late 1970s on the idea of a merger. And this was, it had a variety of false starts, looked like something was going to happen, then nothing happened. Then in 1980, they announced a merger, but later on, John Reed, who was leading the Santa Fe, and by the way, this is the same John Reed who became famous because he stripped Amtrak of the ability to use the name Chief on a couple of passenger trains that they had taken over from Santa Fe, and that was the Texas Chief and the Super Chief. He said, your service doesn't match up, and so therefore you can't use the name anymore, which is why the Super Chief became the Southwest Limited, and the Texas Chief became the Lone Star. Now, later on, after the service did improve, the Santa Fe later on allowed Amtrak to use Chief again. By that point, there was only one train running it would have been applicable to, and that is what is today's Southwest Chief. So in case you're wondering why it has that name, that's why the train is in fact named the Southwest Chief, and John Reed had a lot to do with that. But 1980, they gave it a shot. John Reed said, nope, we're not going to do this. So then in 1983, they decided to do it again, and this was not long after John Reed retired and was replaced by a man named John J. Schmidt. Now, John Schmidt was certainly quite a bit different from John Reed. John Reed, by the time he had led, at the end of his time leading the Santa Fe, he was definitely a lion of the industry, but he was certainly going on to become a lion in winter. He had led the company for a long time. He was an older man. He was definitely viewed by many to be somebody that you called Mr. as opposed to John, was not outgoing in that way, is, an old man of the industry. But Schmidt, he was just ready to do pretty much anything he possibly could. He is painted as being somebody who's very gregarious, although at the same time, very arrogant. And he was talking about a lot of things, including the potential for acquiring Conrail and being aggressive in just about any way that he could grow the Santa Fe. Now, whereas Reed had come up through the ranks of the railroad operating side, Schmidt had come up from the other side, which included oil, gas, properties, a variety of assets that a lot of railroads did have as a result of being very large land owners. But this is what got him into corporate planning and then eventually into the big chair leading the Santa Fe. Now, 1983 comes along. Schmidt takes over. The deal between the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific comes back, and this is where everything goes a little bit haywire, because almost after the deal was finally announced, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific, their holding companies, merged to create Santa Fe Southern Pacific Corporation. Now, that's important because the holding company is Santa Fe Southern Pacific, whereas the railroad itself would have been Southern Pacific Santa Fe. So that looks like it's a great way of kind of mollifying both sides of this. However, this is a key note and goes into what we were talking about, how lawyers tend to structure transactions. Because they had the ability to merge the holding companies, because a holding company, especially in the railroad context, is something that has no strict business purpose other than to hold the shares of a variety of operating companies. There's almost never a problem with holding companies merging together because they have little business other than owning things. However, when it comes to operating companies, that's usually where you're going to get some kind of a review. In the case of the railroads at the time, it was the Interstate Commerce Commission. If it were being done today, it would be the Surface Transportation Board. In other industries, you might see something along the lines of a Department of Justice review that takes place, because that's where you start to have questions about competitiveness. That's where you start to have questions about prices that customers will have to pay, or if employees are going to be let go. So, by merging the holding companies together, at least a portion of the victory was achieved, which was that the shareholders of both companies were willing to go all in on the deal, as well as both sides of management. However, the Interstate Commerce Commission, even in the deregulated world, certainly had to be mollified, and if they didn't give their approval, as we know, no transaction can take place. And an added problem is you, as either an individual or a corporation, cannot control a railroad without receiving the approval of the Interstate Commerce Commission, or today, the Surface Transportation Board. Now, if I, Phil Bell, were to go out and buy a railroad tomorrow, I would do what's called filing an exemption. An exemption basically says, look, I'm Phil, I'm buying this railroad, I don't own any other railroads. There's not going to be any kind of significant impact of this transaction other than me taking over this railroad and maybe putting my name on it. But that's all that's going to be there. That's fine. And that's why the exemption process was created, to be something as a very quick and easy way to receive approval of the governing authority. Again, today, the Surface Transportation Board, then the Interstate Commerce Commission, without having to go through an extended review. For example, when Warren Buffett purchased the BNSF, he filed, or Berkshire Hathaway, I should say, filed an exemption, because even though he was buying one of the nation's biggest railroads, it was understood at the time that they did not control any other railroads and there would not be any kind of competitive issues with this, and the board approved it. Now, as an aside, we found out later that Berkshire Hathaway did in fact own some other railroads. These were very small industrial short lines and eventually had to be sold off, but this is something that apparently Berkshire Hathaway did not understand was the case, which shows you how sprawling an enterprise that Berkshire Hathaway really is, nor did the Surface Transportation Board understand that. But Warren Buffett did, Berkshire Hathaway did file the exemption in order to control BNSF. However, in a transaction like this, where you're certainly going to have two major railroads merging together, there is going to be the full approval process, which is the same thing that even under the Surface Transportation Board takes place. And there'll be a variety of questions asked. Does this, is this in the public interest, which is a nebulous term that was created by the government simply so they could have some kind of influence in these transactions? They will ask about what the impact is going to be on the employees, what the impact is going to be on the shippers, and what the impact is going to be on the environment. And so a variety of studies have to be produced. There will be testimony, there will be objections, and there will also be efforts to mollify those objections. And while this process takes place, if for whatever reason you as either an individual or an entity own more than one railroad, and usually that's the two railroads that are seeking to merge together, you're going to have to place one in what's called a voting trust. Now, this was proposed a few years ago when E. Hunter Harrison was seeking to take over CSX while he was the head of Canadian Pacific, and said, well, we're going to put one of these railroads in a voting trust. And CN actually proposed something similar when it was trying to get into a transaction as well, and this was designed to be a way that you could mollify any concern on the part of the board about doing the transaction, and ultimately none of that came to pass. But that was the first time in many years that a voting trust had come back into the front of the public consciousness. But why are we talking so much about the voting trust and these arrangements? Well, because the Southern Pacific, a big sprawling 13,000 plus mile railroad, was placed in the voting trust. And in the time leading up to it, it had been in decline. It was not in the best shape, although it was effectively providing its services. But during the period that it was in the voting trust, which was just about 5 years, it was had a very difficult time raising any capital that was needed for capital improvements. And if you're a stalwart listener of the All Aboard podcast, you know the most important thing for a railroad to do is make a profit and be able to raise capital, because without that, all of the things that make a railroad go, whether it's the tracks, the subgrade, the locomotives, or otherwise, everything short of the people, need continuous capital investment. And quite frankly, people need that too, because if they're working with equipment or rights of way that are in terrible shape, they're going to have a tough time. So every nickel that's invested in capital assets like locomotives is also being invested in the individuals who operate and maintain them, even if that's not necessarily always reflected in your paychecks. And so the Southern Pacific, while this is happening, is certainly declining. At the same time, the people who are leading the process, John J. Schmidt and a lot of the people from the Santa Fe team, are, as it's been said, playing hardball with the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they are trying to do everything to avoid making any sort of concessions to the railroads that are around. And remember, this is a time when you have the Burlington Northern, the Union Pacific. Union Pacific had recently merged with the Western Pacific and the Missouri Pacific, which was a very significant transaction, which I'm surprised did not end up with more scrutiny, although it was there. The Denver and Rio Grande Western, that was a big part of the area. By this point, it was controlled by Phil Anschutz, who is someone that we will talk about a little bit later because he will continue to be a player in this. You have the Missouri, Kansas, Texas. You also have the Kansas City Southern, the Illinois Central, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Sioux Line, and the Milwaukee Road. All these carriers are still around, and they are still big players in the Western railroad scene. And all of these carriers, in one way or the other, were trying to get some sort of piece of the pie or some sort of compensation because of this merger. And let's also not forget there were other carriers that were growing at the time, so like the Chicago, Missouri, and Western, Mid-South, and so on, who were on the periphery of a lot of the territory that would be impacted. So for a railroad to go in a major transaction that would have put a substantial part of one state, and this of course being California, under the control of one railroad, that meant they most certainly could not be playing hardball with the Interstate Commerce Commission and telling them, no, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to answer any of the concerns that other railroads in the region have, even if those concerns were not necessarily valid. And I'll give you one important piece. As you go through, whether you're listening to this podcast or you're reading about railroad mergers in other sources, you'll find out that a lot of railroads always come out of the woodwork in every major merger case in order to get something out of it. Most of their claims, quite frankly, are not all that valid. Yes, it might cause them to lose some traffic here or there, but they always have the ability to go out and say, well, if we're going to lose that traffic, we're going to try another way to get other traffic or be more competitive. However, there are situations where, and this would have been a big one in the case of the Union Pacific, for example, because for many years, the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific exchanged a lot of traffic at Ogden, Utah. Of course, this would be yet another reason to send far less traffic through Ogden, Utah, and over the Union Pacific. And the same goes for some of the smaller railroads, such as what is now the Iowa Interstate. It had a different name at that time after it was resurrecting parts of the Rock Island after that had fallen apart. The Denver and Rio Grande Western, it was slowly losing all of its connections and quickly becoming a bridge line with very little bridge traffic. It too would have been negatively impacted by this, seeing as more traffic would be leaving the Southern Pacific lines that connected to it at Ogden and Salt Lake City, and now moving over parts of the Santa Fe. So, making these concessions is good business sense, especially because the Interstate Commerce Commission always viewed itself as being, number one, the guarantor of rail service for the public, whether the public are rail shippers for freight service or passengers for passenger service. But it also viewed itself as being the architect of the railroad map, even if a lot of the pleading for the architecture is coming from the private railroads themselves. So any effort that was made to disregard the board or minimize, the commission, or minimize it or otherwise was bound to fail, and it did. In 1986, the Interstate Commerce Commission said a quick no to the merger proposal, and that meant scenes like this. And those are the only two locomotives that were ever fully painted for Southern Pacific Santa Fe. A couple of Santa Fe SD45-2s would simply not happen. By the way, what I think is really interesting for those of you who are seeing this on CP5 Cam, obviously we've talked about the Kodachrome colors, yellow and red with the black roof. Notice the silver trucks. Those are probably not going to be the case broadly on Southern Pacific Santa Fe had it happened. That was certainly a flourish of the Santa Fe itself. Another thing that I think is very interesting are the red number boards with white lettering. Most railroads, even today, use either white numerals on a black background or black numerals on a white background. Very rarely do you see anything else. The Clinchfield is notable for that because they had yellow number boards or yellow background, and that is largely due to the fact, at least as I understand it, because they had so much grime and coal dust because of all of the coal that the Clinchfield was moving. But I thought it was a very interesting touch that this is what SPSF was going for, especially in a time when some more simplistic paint schemes were certainly in vogue, and you could see that with Norfolk Southern going to black with white lettering on it, or CSX of the time, blue and gray without anything else, until, of course, a lot of just yapping from people who were concerned about grade crossing visibility and so on prompted them to add the yellow, and that's what led to the famous yellow nose schemes, YN2 and YN3, that became so popular among rail fans. Now, that was 1986. 1987, they try again. They make a lot of concessions. The Interstate Commerce Commission still says no, and that is the end of Southern Pacific Santa Fe. So, what happens after? Remember what I told you. The Southern Pacific was in a voting trust, so they had to sell it. And eventually it was purchased by Phil Anschutz, and he is the Denver billionaire that controlled the Denver and Rio Grande Western. He ended up taking over the Southern Pacific and operating it together with the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Now, eventually it would be called the Southern Pacific Lines, and I'll show you a map of what the Southern Pacific Lines looked like, because this got to be a very, very interesting railroad. What you see across the center, Missouri into Kansas, Colorado, and up into Utah, that is almost all Rio Grande. Now, the Rio Grande, of course, itself is the portion in Colorado and Utah up to Salt Lake City and Ogden, and then the original Southern Pacific west of there. But what you see east of Denver, going across Kansas and into Kansas City, Missouri, that was operating rights on the former Missouri Pacific, which Union Pacific didn't really use ever during the time that they owned it, before they pulled up a big portion of that line, because they routed their trains over the Kansas Pacific, which was largely a long time part of the Union Pacific then and now. What they also did was acquired parts of the Chicago, Missouri and Western, which we discussed in our series on regional railroads, and ended up getting operating rights on the Burlington Northern as part of Southern Pacific Chicago St. Louis Corporation, and known internally in that company, SP, as Spissel. So yes, in case you wonder, where do all the crazy nicknames come from? Sometimes they come from inside the companies themselves. And that is one of the ways that Southern Pacific ended up finally getting into Chicago, which it would have done had the SPSF merger taken place. But of course, as we know, it did not. Now, this was, of course, not the end of the story, because another interesting part of this was, as the Southern Pacific was placed in that voting trust, a lot of properties of the Southern Pacific, pretty much everything that wasn't a railroad, was part of the Santa Fe Southern Pacific Corporation, the holding company that would have owned the Southern Pacific Santa Fe Railway. And after the Southern Pacific is placed in the voting trust and then sold, all of those other properties, which was valuable real estate in places like California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and so on, stayed with the Santa Fe. One of those valuable pieces of property was Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal, now known as Los Angeles Union Station. You've undoubtedly seen that in movies, mostly inside, but a few outside, and this is what it looks like right there on CP5 cam. That was one of the pieces that was sold off by what was called Catellus Development, and this was a subsidiary of the Santa Fe. So the Santa Fe really did look like it was in a prime position in order to capitalize on a lot of these assets and not have to go through the process of actually merging with the Southern Pacific, even though it really did, in fact, want to, as best we can tell. However, a man named Michael Dingman, who was the head of the Henley Group, would come along and try to do a hostile takeover of Santa Fe Southern Pacific, which by now, of course, consisted of these properties and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. And Rob Krebs, who had come over from the Southern Pacific to the Santa Fe during the merger planning time, was running the Santa Fe at the time. And so he went through a variety of machinations, starting with the poison pill defense. And for those who are not familiar with the poison pill, this is one of a variety of things that a company can do. And it usually means issuing a raft of shares, or in some cases selling bonds, but usually a raft of shares, in order to dilute the holdings of somebody who is believed to be a hostile acquirer. And now, in the business context, a hostile acquirer is not somebody who's showing up with guns and knives and spears or anything like that. They are simply attempting to take over a public company without the consent of management. And it's important to remember, although we might look at a company as being run by management and management has all the power, management actually has relatively little power in the cases of companies with widely held shares. And that is anybody from a company like Comcast to someone like CSX. Now, in some instances, Comcast is a good example, you'll have what's called super voting shares, and super voting shares allow those shareholders to have more than one vote per share. And that, in the case of Comcast, is how the Roberts family that founded the company remains in control despite owning actually very little of it. No matter what you do, if I have billions and billions of dollars and try to take Comcast over, I could buy almost every share of stock out there, and the Roberts family could then just vote whatever they wanted to do, including calling me a dunce, which I would be if I tried to do that. And like putting that on my desk and then throwing my desk out the window because I wouldn't even be allowed to come on the property despite actually owning the majority of the company. That's the power of super voting shares. In this case, though, rather than having super voting shares, Santa Fe tried to dilute the ownership of the Henley Group if they crossed a certain threshold, which in this case would have been 20% ownership in the company. And so they could continue to do that over and over and over again. And some companies do have this as part of their corporate governance in order to ward off potential acquirers that don't get the approval of the company's managers and board of directors. Another thing that Rob Krebs did in order to keep Santa Fe Southern Pacific independent was to borrow a lot of money and pay a special dividend to shareholders. Now, this is always a very difficult thing to do because, on one hand, you're taking on debt, which is going to negatively impact the company's ability to perform in the future, especially because this debt is not being invested in anything like locomotives or upgrades to rights of way or otherwise. It's simply being bought into the company to give to shareholders. And of course, we love the idea of dividends as being free market people and investors in the stock market. But this dividend, which is about a $12 dividend, did saddle the company with a substantially more debt. And what that meant is if Dingman and the Henley Group had continued to pursue this, then they would have had a hard time collateralizing the company's assets in order to buy out the remaining shareholders. So eventually Dingman and the Henley Group go away, and the Santa Fe is on its own, heavily indebted. Now, the great story, though, is that they do end up paying down a lot of the debt. And as we've discussed I think it was episode 39, they ended up putting together the partnership with J.B. Hunt and growing as a company until merging with the Burlington Northern in the 1990s. And that also was something of a interesting time because the Santa Fe, after it had started to grow strong again, became the subject of a bidding war between Union Pacific and Burlington Northern. Some have suggested that the Union Pacific knew that it would never actually be able to take over the Santa Fe, and they simply just kept driving the price up to make sure that the BN would have to pay more and therefore be at a competitive disadvantage for a few years. But it did end up merging with the Burlington Northern, and that's what created today's BNSF, which is largely unchanged from that time and has continued to operate and be a force in the western part of the United States, and of course now part of Berkshire Hathaway. The Southern Pacific, on the other hand, continued to operate together with the Rio Grande until 1996, when it merged with the Union Pacific after Phil Anschutz sold his stake to Union Pacific and became a vice chair of that company for some time. One interesting thing, in case you're wondering, for those of you who are a little bit more pop culture than you are railroading, Phil Anschutz's name did come up a lot, unfortunately, when Michael Jackson passed away, because he is the A in AEG, and AEG owns the Staples Center, which I think now is a Crypto.com arena, and a few other properties where Michael Jackson was actually going to be performing on that tour when he passed away while he was rehearsing. So when that happened, the name Phil Anschutz, which is almost always out of the limelight because Mr. Anschutz is a very private person. Which is crazy because he is a tremendous businessman and has done a lot over a variety of industries, not to mention using the Southern Pacific and Rio Grande to create the fiber optic network that underlied Quest, the phone company Quest, which was big in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And they didn't just build that fiber optic network along the Southern Pacific and Rio Grande lines, by the way. They went all over the place. And I remember in the late 90s, I think it was either 98 or 99, I was at the laundromat with my grandmother in Tallahassee, and that's where I went to high school, Tallahassee, Florida. And what do you know, but Quest's Jeep 7s and their train came across the Tallahassee subdivision right in view of the laundromat. And while we're there, we're seeing them washing the clothes. We're seeing them lay fiber optic cable, which of course today is helping make possible things like the All Aboard podcast here. So as we wind this down, just ask the question, what did the ICC make the wrong call? Should they have allowed the Santa Fe Southern Pacific Santa Fe merger to take place? I would say yes, because had they done so, that would have led to a three-system West. You would have had the Union Pacific, which together with the Missouri Pacific and Western Pacific that they had taken over would have been one of the two, the Southern Pacific Santa Fe, the second, and the Burlington Northern, the third. Each of them would have had some smaller carriers to fight over. There's the potential that maybe this Canadian Pacific under that scenario could have divested the Soo line if one of these carriers had made a large enough offer. Another question is what does this do to the Powder River Basin? Does Southern Pacific somehow find a way to get in there? What comes of the Rio Grande? I'm not sure, but these are certainly things that I believe would have led to a much more efficient and much more profitable arrangement of the rail assets of the West had the Interstate Commerce Commission simply said, okay, you know what, we'll impose conditions, to mollify them rather than simply throw the case out and say, well, we don't think it's in the public interest. The other thing to think about is what would its financial fortunes have been. And I say it would have been quite good because you had the Permian Basin boom that took place in the 2000s with oil. You also had the growth of intermodal traffic, and both Southern Pacific and Santa Fe were very strong in this. The Santa Fe from the trailer side, the Southern Pacific with the container side. And they would have built these railroads into a very, very strong intermodal focused system long before that came into vogue in other parts of the rail industry. So, should you paint so fast? I actually think you should. I think they made the right effort, even if the wrong decision came out there. But I hope you will share your thoughts in the comments here, in addition to taking this to your friends, your family, your colleagues, anybody who you know likes trains, loves trains, or may just be indifferent and wants to hear a good podcast. So thank you for being with us. We will be back next week with a couple of great topics. And by the way, next Thursday being the first Thursday of the month, we will be doing a book review that is related to Amtrak because May 1st will be yet another birthday for the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. So we will see you down the main line, and thank you for choosing the All Aboard podcast.